This presentation is going to consider the concept of community indicators. Most people have heard of economic indicators, as these types of things are often reported in the news, and some people may have heard of social indicators, even though they're less common. And in either case, both economic and social indicators tend to be measured at a national level. So what we're going to be looking at is community indicators, and of course they're measured at a local level. And there's a heavy emphasis here on the quality of life in communities, and we're going to consider the roles of objective and subjective measures. The first thing we have to think about is, what do we get from an indicator? Why do they matter? And going back to economic indicators, as many people are familiar with those, they're a way of keeping your thumb on the pulse, right? Of making sure that the economy is healthy, that it's growing, that it's at least being maintained, and that there aren't any major problems. And when problems do emerge, because we're taking measurements, we should become aware pretty quickly, and that can help us become more responsive. And that's something that is routinely done with the economy, but it's not done in terms of a broader set of indicators. Now, there was a movement in the 70s to try to measure social indicators, and again, this was typically done at the national level. And here we got into things such as education, health, housing, and crime. And these things, of course, all matter, and it's important to keep an eye on our progress. How are these things progressing? Are we going backwards? Are we going forward? And, of course, that will help us respond. So as we introduce this concept of community indicators, again, we're at the local level. We're not looking at national trends. And we may actually consider social and economic indicators as part of their community indicator analysis, but there's no reason to stop there. And generally speaking, there's a broad focus on quality of life here, and because there's less available objective data at the local level, we often rely more heavily on subjective viewpoints of residents. And so this can give us a direct view into what it's like living in the community. Of course, the downside is when we rely more heavily on subjective reports, we're not necessarily coming away with a strong objective understanding. And to kind of drill into this idea of objective versus subjective, we can turn to the example of crime. And oftentimes there's a big mismatch. In fact, at least at the national level, reports of crime have gone up at the very same time that the actual crime rate, as measured by, say, the Uniform Crime Report, has been going down. So the perception and the reality do not always find each other on the same page. And that's something that we need to be aware of as we think about developing community indicators. Another advantage of objective community indicators is that they allow you to compare across communities. So for instance, if you're looking at the percentage of the population that drops out of high school, that's an objective measure, and we can look at several communities and we can rank order them, and that can help us, prioritize which communities need the most help. With subjective measurement, the ability to compare across cases becomes more difficult because there are different factors at play that may shape subjective interpretations differently within communities. So that is one of the downsides of subjective measurements. We should acknowledge the fact that this discussion of community indicators is really part of a broader research concern with measurement. And so in social research, when we talk about measurement, we usually talk about two important concepts. One of those is conceptualization, that is, an abstract consideration of what a particular concept means. So for example, crime. Well, what do we mean by crime? Do we mean property crime? Do we mean violent crime? Do we mean white-collar crime? And because all of those things fall within the idea of crime, they all belong there, but they all would be measured very differently. And that brings us to our second important concept, and that is operationalization. And that gets us to where we're actually measuring things. They're concrete indicators that purport to measure the concept in question. So if we're trying to measure white-collar crime, we're going to use a very different set of tools than if we're trying to measure the violent crime rate. And in fact, as you'll see as you go through, many concepts are hard to measure. And usually when we measure a more complex concept, we have to use not just one, but a battery of items to try to measure that thing, whatever it is. And for example, educational quality is one of those broad ideas, so as we conceptualize that, we think about, well, what do we mean by educational quality? Well, you can break that down into bite-sized pieces, and as we try to measure that, you might think of, well, if educational quality is high, then the dropout rate should be low. There should probably be a lot of resources available in terms of expenditures on schooling. Attendance rates ought to be high. The quality of the library should be very good. The student-teacher ratio should be favorable, and so on, right? We can probably come up with a pretty lengthy and impressive list. And any one of those items by itself isn't a all-encompassing indicator, but when you combine all of the indicators into, say, an index or something like that, we're able to get a better and more robust measurement of something like educational quality. And when we measure community quality of life, and we'll talk about that in other places in this class, there are several indicators we can use, and as with the previous example on education, what we will do is identify a number of individual pieces that we can then sew together to create a broad index, which will give us an overall picture. And we should note, though, that community indicators are really, at best, just describing conditions, right? And that alone will not dictate policy or point the way forward. That we always need to rely on some kind of an interpretation and evaluation. And with that, we usually have to turn to theory to some degree. But if we're going to try to assess community progress or improvement, we need to use community indicators and an evaluation framework. Evaluation usually starts with establishing some kind of baseline. And of course, with goal setting, we're also establishing some kind of benchmarks, right? So maybe we're trying to improve the educational quality of a community, and we take a baseline measure of dropout rates, and say we see that there's a 15% dropout rate. Well, we might set a benchmark to have that drop by 5% in the next 5 years through the implementation of a range of programs or policies. So evaluation can help us evaluate whether or not those programs or policies have been effective, and if they've not, then we at least know we've got to adjust and make changes in order to meet those goals. And that's pretty much how community indicators interact with an evaluation framework and policy and planning. But even the best evaluation research relies on a good understanding of what's going on and why it's happening. So if we're studying something like dropout rates, we need to come up with a strong theoretical understanding of why educational quality could suffer in general and why dropout rates may suffer in particular. And once we have a good theoretical idea, we can begin to construct models that try to simulate or predict outcomes such as the dropout rate. But when we're looking for community indicators, it's always a good idea to start with what's available. And fortunately, there is at least some objective data available for most communities in the United States, and the U.S. Census is the major source for that. And there we've got the American Community Survey, the U.S. Census itself, and the County and City Data Book, and we can pull information out of those about the population, about education and housing, and households, characteristics, relationships, and so on. And we also have a census of commerce and a census of agriculture, which can tell us a little bit more about the economy. And we already mentioned that economic indicators have been a priority for some time and probably will continue to be. But when we're selecting our community indicators, we should decide if we're studying internal dynamics of a community, that is a within or intra-community analysis, or are we looking between communities in order to make comparisons? Because as we noted earlier, objective data are better for comparing communities, while subjective data may be better for assessing what's going on within communities. If we're going to try to assemble a list of community indicators that measure the quality of life in a community, then a useful framework to turn to is the community capitals framework that we've discussed in other places, and is informative for establishing our general areas of measurement. So, for instance, we'll want to measure the social capital, which will turn our attention to networks and patterns of social interaction. We'll want to look at cultural capital, and that will direct us to looking at things such as the arts, history, theater, and museums. We'll want to look at human capital measured in terms of education, health, and crime. We'll want to look at political capital, looking at who's got the power to participate in the decision-making process and levels of pluralism. Economic capital, looking at the vitality of the economy, the inclusiveness of the economy. Are people being involved in the economy, or is it controlled by outside interests? We'll want to look at how locally based the economy is, how embedded it is. We want to look at built capital. What kind of condition is the infrastructure in the buildings, the homes, the roads, the bridges, the sidewalks, the electricity, the water, the sewage, and so on. And finally, we want to look at the natural capital. What kind of environmental conditions are we dealing with? Is it suitable for recreation? What's the quality of the air, the land, and the water? Or are there any challenges? Right? And so taken together, each of these dimensions paint a holistic and total picture of what it's like to live in the community, and they can also serve as baseline or benchmarks, right, to measure progress. In the Lyon and Driskell text, they note another instrument that's been used to measure quality of life, Jacksonville's quality of life measurement. And as you go down this table here, and I realize the text is a little bit small, but you can kind of see what the goals are in terms of measurement. And we see achieving educational excellence, growing a vibrant economy, preserving the natural environment, promoting social well-being and harmony, enjoying the arts, culture, and recreation, sustaining a healthy community, maintaining responsive government, moving around efficiently and safely, and keeping the community safe. So these are not necessarily tied to the community capitals framework, although we can see a lot of parallels there. But it's more topic oriented. What kind of characteristics do you hope to see in a successful community? And this is the list they came up with. And as you look at the actual indicators of those ideas, you do see a mixture of objective and subjective measurements. So if we go down to the bottom of the table, for instance, keeping the community safe, we see there's a subjective, people feel safe in their neighborhood, and an objective, the index crimes per 100,000, which is a secondary data item. And so between those things, we're able to, again, get a more robust measurement. So to sum up our discussion of community indicators, we want to look at this concept of quality of life a little more in terms of thinking about what it means and identifying the basic building blocks of a desirable community. And we've been using sustainability as the basic organizing framework for thinking, and then also looking at the community capitals framework as being highly compatible with a sustainability structure. And it helps us think about specific indicators, whether objective or subjective, ways that we can try to capture what we mean by social capital, human capital, cultural capital, and so on. And with these tools, we're able to make the transition into a more scientific approach to understanding, describing, and explaining community outcomes.